Between 1500 and 1900, the pursuit of sugar and spices drove the largest forced migration in human history. Approximately 12.5 million Africans were kidnapped, transported across the Atlantic, and enslaved to produce these goods. This wasn't a side effect of global trade. It was the engine. Sugar, slaves, and spices. The three pillars of early modern capitalism. The foundation of the global economy we inherited. And most people have no idea. Hundreds of acres of cane fields, harvested, processed, refined. Continuous, backbreaking work in tropical climates. European economies couldn't supply that labor. European populations wouldn't accept those conditions. Someone else would have to do it. Sugar plantations were industrial operations before the Industrial Revolution existed. Cutting cane was brutal physical labor. Stalks grew 12 feet tall, surrounded by razor-sharp leaves. Workers used machetes, cutting hundreds of stalks per day in Caribbean heat. Processing was worse. Cane had to be crushed immediately after cutting to extract juice. Mills ran continuously during harvest season. Workers fed stalks into grinding machinery. Hands and arms were regularly mangled. Deaths from mill injuries were routine. The juice was boiled into syrup, then crystallized into sugar. Boiling, that's in tropical heat. Burns. Scalding. Constant danger. This wasn't farming. This was industrial production demanding unlimited labor with zero regard for human life. The connection between sugar and slavery wasn't coincidental. It was the foundation of the system. European colonists tried enslaving indigenous peoples first. Disease killed them in devastating numbers. Indigenous populations in the Caribbean dropped by 90% within decades of European contact. Next came indentured servants from Europe. They survived the climate better but had legal rights, expiration dates on their service, and the ability to leave after their terms ended. Neither source provided what plantation owners needed: unlimited, controllable, disposable labor. Africa did. Between 1526 and 1870, approximately 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. About 10.7 million survived the journey. The Caribbean alone received approximately 4.2 million enslaved Africans, more than any other destination. Why? Because Caribbean sugar plantations killed enslaved people at extraordinary rates. When workers died, more were purchased. The system was designed around replacement, not preservation. Ships designed to carry cargo were repurposed to carry humans. The enslaved were packed into holds designed for barrels of goods, lying on wooden shelves, chained together, unable to stand or turn. Crossings took 4 to 8 weeks. Mortality rates varied. On good crossings, 5–10 died. On bad crossings, 20–30. Disease spread rapidly in the confined, filthy conditions. Dysentery, typhus, smallpox. Bodies of the dead were thrown overboard. Children born on plantations often didn't survive infancy. Enslaved women were sometimes forced to work during pregnancy and days after giving birth. Punishment was systematic and brutal. Whipping was standard. Branding was common. Dismemberment, burning alive, being broken on the wheel, all documented punishments for resistance or even perceived disrespect. Enslaved people worked from sunrise to sunset, sometimes longer during harvest. 7 days a week during peak season. This wasn't agriculture. This was systematic destruction of human beings for economic output. The Dutch East India Company VOC, chartered in 1602, became history's first multinational corporation and one of the most ruthless organizations ever created. The VOC wanted exclusive control of the nutmeg trade. The Banda Islands indigenous population, the Bandanese, traded spices with multiple European powers and local merchants. The VOC's response: genocide. In 1621, VOC forces under Jan Pieter Koen invaded the Banda Islands. They massacred the indigenous population. Enslaved survivors replaced the Bandanese with enslaved laborers brought from other Indonesian islands. Of the estimated 15,000 Bandanese before the Dutch arrival, fewer than 1,000 survived. Some estimates suggest only a few hundred. This wasn't conquest. It was extermination for market control. The wealth generated by spice trade financed further exploration, further colonization, further plantation development. Spice profits funded the ships that carried enslaved people, financed the plantations that produced sugar, created the banking systems that facilitated the trade. The Bank of England, founded in 1694, was partly capitalized by merchants who made their fortunes in the slave trade and plantation economy. Caribbean sugar profits funded the Industrial Revolution. The wealth accumulated by plantation owners was reinvested in British manufacturing, infrastructure, and technology. These financial instruments became the building blocks of modern banking and investment. The Rotterdam Stock Exchange traded shares in slave trading companies. London merchants created sophisticated financial products to manage plantation risk. Modern Wall Street traces its origins to these financial systems. The New York Stock Exchange's early days included slave trading as a legitimate commodity. Tea, imported from Asia, became inseparable from sugar in European and American consumption. Two commodities, both produced through exploitation, became the foundation of daily ritual. The slave trade permanently altered the racial demographics of the Americas. The Caribbean, originally populated by indigenous peoples, became predominantly Black African through forced migration. Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, all demographically transformed by slavery. Brazil, which received more enslaved Africans than any other country, approximately 4.9 million, has the largest black population outside Africa. The United States black population, approximately 44 million today, descends primarily from enslaved people brought during this period. These demographic shifts weren't natural. They were the result of systematic kidnapping, forced transportation, and the murder of indigenous populations. The wealth extracted through slavery and the spice trade wasn't just historical. It created structural advantages and disadvantages that persist. Plantation wealth funded British industrialization. The wealth gap between formerly colonizing nations and formerly colonized nations traces directly to this period. Caribbean nations that were sugar colonies remain among the world's poorest. The wealth their enslaved populations created left with the colonizers. The reparations debate asks a simple question. If wealth was systematically extracted from certain populations through documented violence and theft, does responsibility for repair exist? This isn't a new question. It's been asked since the first abolitionists recognized that ending slavery wasn't the same as addressing the damage slavery caused. Everything you consume has a supply chain. Some of those supply chains are clean, many aren't. Sugar today is produced in conditions that, while improved from plantation slavery, still frequently involve exploitative labor. In Brazil, Guatemala, Haiti, sugar production has been documented with conditions approaching forced labor in the 21st century. The systems created by sugar, slaves, and spices didn't disappear with abolition. They evolved, adapted, continued exploiting the same populations through different mechanisms. Understanding the history isn't just academic. It's the foundation for understanding how the global economy actually functions. These three pillars aren't separate from modern capitalism. They're its origin story. How do you participate in a global economy built on human suffering? How do you consume products whose origins involve genocide, slavery, and systematic exploitation? How do you acknowledge history without being paralyzed by it? These questions don't have simple answers, but they deserve honest confrontation. Abolition happened. Slavery ended officially, in most places, by the late 19th century. But the wealth extracted continued compounding. The economic structures created during this period persist. The nations that benefited from colonialism and slavery remain wealthier. The nations that were exploited remain poorer. This isn't coincidence. It's causation. Understanding this doesn't require guilt. It requires honesty about how the world was built, who paid the price, and what obligations that history creates. Consumer awareness matters but isn't sufficient. Individual choices about fair trade sugar or ethically sourced spices improve conditions marginally. Systemic change requires systemic action. Reparations conversations, trade policy reform, development aid that addresses colonial-era extraction, labor protections enforced globally. The sweetness in your coffee was paid for in blood. The spices in your kitchen were purchased with genocide. Knowing this doesn't change the past, but it changes what's possible going forward. Remember, the sweetness in your life has a history. It's not sweet But understanding it is the first step toward building something better.